Good evening, I'm Dr. Ben Weitz. Welcome to the Functional Medicine Discussion Group. And we have some great events planned in the future as well. February 22nd, we have Dr. Sam Rabar, who's here, and we're going to talk about IBS. And March 29th, Dr. Bashtani, we're going to talk about autoimmune diseases. And we're lining up some other speakers for the rest of the year. Please check out my Rational Wellness podcast on iTunes and YouTube. So our agenda for this evening, I'm asking Adam Banning from Metagenics to come up and tell us a little bit about the Phytomulti from Metagenics. After that, I'll introduce the topic and then I'll introduce our speaker, Holly Lucille. So I want to thank Metagenics for sponsoring our event tonight. Here's Adam Banning.
Yeah.
Hey, Adam.
Hey, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Excellent.
Good to see you.
Good. There we go. Today we're talking about Phytomulti. Why are we talking about Phytomulti? Well, Phytomulti is a very interesting formula. As we know, inflammation is a major cause as it relates to many of diseases and disorders, as bringing them on or promoting them or keeping them around. Inflammatory disorders are related to so many of our different issues as it relates to chronic disease. As we know, reactive oxygen species through NF-kappa B will actually form greater amounts of inflammation in our body as a nuclear expression. So just on that basis, being able to have a very, very phytonutrient-rich, extremely good quencher of free radicals is probably a good thing to have. As we know, the average amount of free radical quenching that happens, let's say in 10 servings of fruits and vegetables, when they're organic, is about 5,000 ORAC value. ORAC value, as you might know already, is a measurement of free radical quenching. So basically speaking, if we're going to get that in 10 servings, wouldn't it be nice to be able to have even more than that? Because it's hard to get even 10 servings into your patients of fruits and vegetables now, isn't it? Okay, especially with today's diet, in regards to the standard American diet, and whatever modified version your patients may be on, they're making a compromise with you many times to be able to get more fruits and vegetables in. So basically speaking, Phytomulti is interesting because it doesn't have 5,000 in regards to the ORAC value, it has 25,000, and that's just in 2 tablets. Very, very interestingly, we know the following, is that individuals don't prematurely age. One of the major factors in regards to premature aging is improper cell replication. You don't have a single cell in your body which lasts as long as you do. You get a brand new gastrointestinal tract every 9 months, you get a brand new body every 5 to 7 years. And that's due to cell replication. So let's take a look at what happens in regards to cell replication. Let's say you have a liver cell. On average, they live for about 3 months. What happens after they die? Well, what happens is they're like almost like a perfect employee. They find themselves or create themselves their own replacement. Okay? So don't you wish that happened with your front desk person? You know what I mean? We're going to just create a new one when you leave. But that's how cells work. So basically speaking, by the time it takes it to the end of its life or the end of its life cycle, it will pull out the DNA, and whatever form the DNA is in, it will make a copy, and it will keep on doing that over and over and over again through cell replication. Now, if the cell's DNA was the same as it was the day it was born as the day it was just about to die, that would be great. It'd be like having total digital copies, but I'm afraid that's not the situation. There's over 100,000 free radical hits that hit every single cell in your body every single day. Many of them are things like peroxynitrates, which get into the nucleus and start damaging that blueprint that you call your DNA. So when it comes to your DNA on the first day of one of the cells in your body and the last day, it's very different. It's very analogous, and the metaphor would be something like, did you ever make a copy of 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 a copy? And the final copy looks like garbage. That's cell replication when you introduce another factor in there, which is known as free radical damage, which happens within our oxygen-rich atmosphere. So basically speaking, wouldn't it be nice to be able to have a way to be able to quench those? Well, that's good. So quenching free radicals is a good thing, but does it really prove that it helps in anti-aging? And by the way, Phytomulti is the most proven anti-aging multi in the marketplace, okay? So how can we make that claim? It's because we actually did studies on it, and we did something called a COMET assay. A COMET assay is very interesting. It's when you take cells, and you actually take, and you have control cells and cells that are introduced to peroxynitrates in the form of hydrogen peroxide. And that actually starts breaking down the DNA. So we measured how much we could prevent that breaking down of DNA by introducing the phytonutrients found in phytomulti. And we were able to get a 52% better DNA stability, which is quite a lot. So this is helping you duplicate these cells one over again and again and again, so you don't end up with a copy of a copy of a copy Xerox effect. You end up with more digital type of reproduction, reducing the amount of wear and tear to the DNA in and of itself. So basically speaking, that's one thing. The second thing on phytomulti, which is important to point out, is, has anybody ever seen green drinks out there? Anybody ever use green drinks in your practice, things like that? Great. Okay, so when it comes down to it, they put everything, including the kitchen sink, in those things. Oh, we got zeaxanthin, and we got astaxanthin, we got every xanthin you can imagine in there. And then we got a bunch of lycopenes, and this pene, and that pene, so on and so forth. But interestingly enough, when you take a look at many of these formulas, they're blended together, not because they've ever been seen in nature or studied together, but they're blended together almost like the top acts of like rock and roll, you know what I mean? Well, let's put them all together in one place and let's have a concert. So the bottom line on the whole thing is they've never been studied together. And this concept of assumed synergy is highly laughable. And I would say at the least, at the best, highly laughable. How do we know things work together with each other? We at Metagenics actually created a formula known as Caprex, which was made in a combination of 3 different items to be able to lower prostaglandin E2. And we found after testing over 1,000 different items in combinations of 3, okay, we found out that most of the combinations of 3 of these well-known anti-inflammatory nutrients, they didn't have additive effects, they didn't have synergistic effects, they had inhibitive effects on each other. Yet each one of them separately had research. So the concept of combining together all these phytonutrients falls under that same category of, can we really assume synergy? Bottom line on this assuming of synergy, the only way you could assume synergy of phytonutrients is to be able to study a diet that contains all those phytonutrients. And guess what? This phytonutrient combination was done to mirror the exact phytonutrients of the Greek or Athenian Mediterranean diet, which is the most studied diet on the planet right now. So it uses all of the nutrients in the same basic ratios found in the Mediterranean diet, quenching free radicals to equivalent in 2 tablets of 50 servings of fruits and vegetables. And in addition, it has been studied to be able to improve DNA replication, making this the most studied anti-aging multi currently on the marketplace. Do we have any questions? Cool.
Drop the mic. Where do we get them?
Yeah, you know, something like, if this wasn't such a nice mic, you know, you should have like one of these mics where you drop it like this, and it's made out of styrofoam, so you don't really bother anybody. Otherwise, he'd be really mad at him. He's got lots of muscles. Go ahead.
How do you study DNA stability?
Oh, very good question. So basically speaking, what you're doing is you're taking, and we can get you the actual breakdown of what a common assay is, and I really can't get into the entire aspect of it, but the introduction of the actual, in this case, it was actually hydrogen peroxide in sterile fluid, okay, which was introduced to the cell, and it shows a specific pattern of the spill of the DNA, okay? And we can get you all the information in regards to that. If people would like to know that, it's actually on all of our data on the phytomulti itself. I know one other thing, just very quickly here, is we're going to be talking about thyroid function today, and I'd like to be able to talk about just a little bit of an insight in regards to our formula, Thyrosol. Many individuals out there right now are dealing with looking at TSH and T4 as it relates to thyroid. And TSH and T4 are not really the best things to look at in a wide variety of patients out there as it relates to individuals with what we may call subclinical hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's, so on and so forth. So the situation is we want to take a look at things like free T3. We want to be able to take a look at T3 antibodies. We like to be able to take a look at reverse T3, all of these other factors. But you can have all the T3 in the world, and you still sometimes walk, talk, and quack like a little thyroid patient. Why is that the case? The bottom line is that T3 actually has to make it past the cell membrane through the cytosol to the nuclear envelope where it actually comes in contact with what's known as a heterodimer. A heterodimer is a specific receptor site which is combining together either a vitamin A or vitamin D receptor site along with a T3 receptor site, allowing it to get in. So individuals who are actually deficient in vitamin A or vitamin D, well, they're going to have issues. Thyrosol contains vitamin A, vitamin D, and all of the nutrients, by the way, which convert T4, the inactive thyroid, to T3, the active thyroid. And then in addition to that, when it makes it past the nuclear envelope itself, let's say you have enough vitamin A and vitamin D, it actually has to tag itself to the DNA. The tagging of DNA actually requires a nutrient, which is the number 2 most deficient nutrient in the American diet right now. Magnesium is the first one. Second one is zinc, okay? So in regards to zinc, it requires it to tag it and start the process of this actual breaking apart and forming the actual messenger RNA which is coming out. Okay? So after that happens, the messenger RNA leaves the nucleus and goes through the cytosol, heading in that direction. It sees in the distance a mitochondria, and it's sending the message, gentlemen, start your engines, to really build up the mitochondrial function, to build up the basal metabolic rate, and so on and so forth. But between here and when I finally end up there can be a lot of problems. Some of those problems are interleukin-6, this inflammatory messenger, and in addition to that, specific free radicals. Now, how do you handle those to be able to make sure the message doesn't start out, gentlemen, start your engines, and end up, gentlemen, start your engines, when it finally ends up over there? There's something called rosmaric acid, okay, or carnosic acid inside rosemary. So rosemary, zinc, vitamin A and vitamin D, and all of the nutrients in the conversion of T4 and T3 are a really great way to be able to help you, not just in the production of T3, but the actual nuclear expression of T3. This can be used along with thyroid hormone, okay, or without it as well. I actually like it with a small amount of thyroid hormone, especially if people are taking things like Synthroid, Nature-Throid, and other issues. It helps them in the actual expression and conversion. You have a question?
Yeah, don't you need radicals in order to make T3 out of tyrosine?
Right. So the
So
situation.
but if you kill all those, how can you make
If you were to kill all the free radicals in your body, you would be dead.
Right.
Okay?
So how
It's
do
not
you
a
keep
matter
the
of.
balance?
Yeah, okay. So here's what it is. As you know, since you're bringing up this question, there are 5 different subspecies of reactive oxygen species. There are specific forms of antioxidants which actually quench the actual subspecies. So you can actually have antioxidants which quench some and don't quench others. If I were to give you a ton of vitamin C, I wouldn't kill you. Do you know why? Because vitamin C doesn't quench all the free radicals. So I believe that's the answer to your question.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Oh, and one last thing. If you folks love really good podcasts and radio shows, I have my own radio show on KABC 790 AM in Los Angeles. It's on at 9 p.m. at night to 10 every Saturday night. And we have some of the top people in the area of functional medicine, as well as conscious living, things like meditation and other issues, so and other lifestyle approaches. So that's KABC 790 AM, The Adam Harmon Show. Thank you.
So we're going to speak about thyroid today, and I'd like to introduce the topic by going over the history of thyroid disease in this country in a couple of minutes. So as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, for many years, thyroid disease was basically a disease caused by a lack of iodine, which led to an enlargement of the thyroid that was called goiter. And there were parts of this country across the upper Midwest where goiter was endemic. That was called the goiter belt. And the thyroid gland was trying to produce enough thyroid, but it didn't have the necessary ingredients, particularly the iodine. So then we embarked on a nationwide supplement program to add iodine to our food supply, specifically by adding it to salt. And Hashimoto goiter rates basically disappeared, and Hashimoto's autoimmune thyroid rates soared. And the same pattern is seen in a number of other countries around the world, including Greece and Brazil and Turkey, that added iodine, and the exact same thing happened. Goiter rates basically went away and autoimmune thyroid soared. There's at least one experiment where a country removed the iodine, and the exact same thing happened. The Hashimoto rates went down and goiter rates started to grow. So it's clear that there's a controversy about iodine and its relationship with thyroid disease. And so right now there are functional medicine doctors, David Brownstein, who's recommending very high dose thyroid iodine for patients with thyroid disease. Other doctors are recommending a modest dosage of iodine, often contained in thyroid supplements. And then other research indicates that patients who are dealing with autoimmune thyroid, and over 90% of the patients in the United States who have thyroid hypothyroidism have autoimmune Hashimoto's thyroid disease. So there's a lot of research to indicate that you should completely restrict iodine intake for patients with Hashimoto's, otherwise it exacerbates their symptoms. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Holly Lucille, And I really appreciate the fact that she showed up tonight because she's really not feeling her best. And Dr. Lucille is a dynamite naturopathic doctor. She's also a nurse, a registered nurse. She's a nationally recognized educator for natural products, consultant, TV, radio host. She's the author of several books, including Creating and Maintaining Balance, A Woman's Guide to Safe, Natural Hormone Health, and The Healing Power of Trauma Comfrey. She's in private practice in Los Angeles. Her practice is presently part of the Body Well with our friends Michael Carragher and Jill Stocker. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lucille.
Is this on?
I think so.
Check, check. Hello, hello? No?
All right, so thank you. Sorry I missed my introduction and the rest of your. It's really nice to be here. On Thursday evenings, I have a hobby job. I coach CrossFit, one class. And so that's usually why I'm not able to attend. And since I knew I was gonna be here, I switched with somebody and I coached this morning at 6 a.m. And I got up and I said, oh, it's really dry, you know, my throat, yeah, it's just really dry. It was like 4:30 in the morning, right? And by the time I open up the gym and get the adrenaline going, you know, and get through class, and then driving home around 7:30, I go, I don't feel good. So about 2 hours later, I wake up from a nap and I'm like, I gotta call Ben. And he says to me, there's a lot of people that are counting on you. And I wrote him a note and I said, listen, I'm willing to come. I just want you to know. Anyway, I was so proud of myself because I'd been in New York and Michigan and Wisconsin and I wasn't sick at all and everybody was sick around me. So I do apologize. I'm a little heavy-headed, but it is really great to be here. And this is sort of a subject that's near and dear to my heart. When I was a young naturopathic doctor, graduated in 2001, and you know, so excited about my education, my degree, and I came out here. And I do want to give a shout out to Metagenics because when we were passing our licensing bill, Senate Bill 907, to license naturopathic doctors in the state of California, Metagenics was extremely supportive, as were other companies and other entities in our industry, but they were very, very supportive. So they do a lot for us and for our community. But you know, I was so excited about who I was and what I did, and like anytime I'd go, you know, to somebody like, you know, well, what do you do? I'm like, well, I'm a naturopathic doctor. Like, you're a what? Over and over and over again. And it was interesting because even back then, I would start to explain what more of a functional, you know, approach or naturopathic approach is to something, and I would use thyroid as an example. Like I would say, you know, we identify and treat the cause. So let's say an otherwise healthy 30-year-old woman would come down with an elevated TSH or hypothyroidism. Our approach is probably not just going to give Synthroid, but it's going to say, why would an otherwise healthy woman's thyroid start to underfunction? And you know, I've depended on my principles my entire career. They have gotten me out, they've gotten me through all of my clinical situations. The fact that the body has an innate ability to heal itself, that we identify and treat the cause, that we use the least invasive methods to diagnose and treat, that we, doctors as teacher, all of those things. And a lot of times I catch myself saying, you know, medicine really isn't rocket science sometimes, and you know this, right? You see people and there's so much to clean up, there's obstacles to cure, whether it's lifestyle interventions, dietary modifications. But I tell you, when I got into studying endocrinology more and more, and thyroid, the devil is in the details for sure. It really is. There's a lot to think about. And sometimes I liken thyroid function as a relay race, because I feel, quite honestly, when I first started to practice and I would see people come in and see some of the doses of thyroid that they were on, that we were doing with thyroid replacement therapy exactly what was happening with not bioidentical hormones, but Premarin, 0.625 back in the day, where we weren't really thinking things through much. We were just putting them on a medication. And I grew up the daughter of 2 pharmacists, by the way, so I'm well versed in the here, take this approach. That might be what sort of led me to rebel a little bit and take a different, more comprehensive approach. But when you think about thyroid function, I think if you're going to fix somebody's issues with thyroid, we need to figure out where the problem is. And so I liken it to a relay race. And the relay race, almost like a 440 or even a mile relay race, right? So you see these women going around the track and they have to pass the baton. It's like, for me, where did we drop the baton? Where in this entire thyroid function did we drop the baton? So I would say leg 1, if you think about it, would be communication from the hypothalamus pituitary, okay? Down to the thyroid gland. So the activity of the thyroid gland itself, I would say leg 2, right? That's the production of mostly T4, which I believe is a pro-hormone. We've never really identified a receptor site for T4. And then, of course, there's peripheral conversion. That would be, I would say, leg 3. Tons of different issues with peripheral conversion, whether increased binding, whether they're having a hard time converting, but we're having that functional hypothyroidism. And then leg 4 would be what Adam was talking about, where that active thyroid hormone has to get into each and every cell in our body because it's responsible for aerobic and anaerobic metabolism into the nucleus and deliver its message for metabolism. And so my question has always been, if we are going to fix the problems of thyroid, where are the problems? And having good clinical acumen far, far, far outside of the numbers game with labs has always been the way that I've really tried to treat my patients.
That was great. What are the type of symptoms do you look for when you first suspect that a patient may have thyroid problems?
Oh my gosh, I think there are so many, because when you think about the symptoms of hypometabolism, it could be anything. You could be seeing elevated lipids, right? Because you depend on thyroid function for the LDL receptor and decreasing LDL, for gastric motility, for making hydrochloric acid and then pancreatic enzymes, so digestive issues. Thyroid hormones underwrite the transcription and assembly of glycosaminoglycans. Those are our water molecules, right? So then you think of the lustrous hair and the brittle nails and the painful joints. And then you've got water in the intercellular space, so you have some suborbital edema, perhaps some of the edema, the pitting edema in the lower limbs. Thyroid is responsible for helping insulin get glucose into the cell. The lower the thyroid hormone, the more insulin. The more insulin, we see that truncal obesity. Certainly protracted fatigue, thinning of the eyebrows, brain fog, I guess you would call it, cognitive issues. There are so many, really, because it's your metabolism.
By the way, everybody in the audience, feel free to raise your hand and participate and ask questions anytime you want.
Nod, ooh, or.
What do you think are the most beneficial tests to run for measuring thyroid health? And then what do you think is the optimal range for TSH levels, which has been very controversial?
Such an interesting question. I know we're going to talk about subclinical hypothyroidism and sublaboratory hypothyroidism because I have thoughts about all of them because, I'll just jump into it. When we were talking, when I've heard subclinical hypothyroidism and I see patients that are presenting with clinical symptoms, I'm like, there's nothing subclinical about this at all. These people are not feeling well. So what if I'm suspecting thyroid? Well, first of all, I should also say this about the thyroid. I kind of feel like it's the engine light coming on, And if you're in your car and your engine light comes on, do you go to fix the engine light, like change the bulb? Right? No, you have to go figure out. Thyroid comes from the Greek word thyreos, and that means to shield. And I think that's exactly what it's doing for us. It's responsible for chemical changes in our bodies. If we're cold, it revs up the heat. If we have an infection, it's our immune system going. We've got 16-hour days, coffee and Krispy Kreme, it is going to slam on the brakes. But I think when those shifts are chronic, the thyroid starts to falter. And that's why it's so important that we want to sort of check the engine. But if I do suspect a thyroid issue, certainly I have a friend that calls the TSH test a CYA test. So you're always going to CYA and do a TSH. So TSH, total T4, a free T3, ferritin for sure, vitamin D, and thyroid antibodies. I think probably a little bit more depending on individuals, but that at
Do you do
least.
the reverse T3?
It all depends. We'll do reverse T3 if I feel that there's a problem. There's a way that I can understand if there's a binding issue or a conversion issue. And now T4, as you well know, is converted into reverse T3 and T3 almost equally. Without reverse T3, it would be like driving your car without a brake. Okay, it's needed. And so I have a sneaky way of, I can run reverse T3 if that's what the clinical picture sort of leads us to.
And what do you think is the range for TSH that we ought to see as normal?
You know, from the research thus far, and in my clinical experience, I like to see TSH under 2.
Under 2, wow.
Yeah, under 2. I do. Now,
And most labs are still saying 4 or 3.5.
yep, they are. That absolutely is true. There's been many recommendations based on, and there's been a lot of controversy, I think, in the industry itself. Now, I have to say though, it's interesting that this question comes up all the time because when you think about thyroid function, TSH is great. I think it would detect a pituitary tumor pretty well. It's very, I'm not exactly sure how, I use it as part of the puzzle piece, but you know, it's always meant to be a screening tool. It certainly was never meant to predict a dosage or dosage change, that's for sure. And I'm always treating symptoms. We manage the thyroid, but we treat those people, right? We can't treat lab tests, we have to treat people. And it's interesting to me, even for myself, how I get sometimes hung up on TSH and the range because also I would say with an autoimmune condition, it is certainly not a numbers game. And those numbers can be all over the place when we're talking about thyroid panels and thyroid lab tests. And of course, we'll get more and more into this, but I do like to see TSH healthy under 2. If I see a 4, I do want to poke around a little bit, especially if it matches clinical symptoms.
I mean, the argument as to whether TSH levels should be normal as 3 or 4 is that as you lower it, obviously a lot more people end up on thyroid medication, so.
Right, and sometimes that's not going to be the best thing to do. Like, I always like to fix the problems in the engine before I change the bulb, right? So before I go for thyroid replacement therapy, we're looking at being able to fix the problems and where the baton was dropped, per se, pick it back up and keep on running. Thyroid replacement therapy, I think, has its place for sure. It's very, I mean, certainly in an autoimmune destruction because you're losing that tissue that's actually responsible for making those hormones and prohormone T4. But before, I think doing due diligence and fixing those problems is really important. The other thing, I think also, Achilles reflex. I mean, if, you know, when I was a younger student, you know, if you see a reflex is a reflex is a reflex is a reflex until you see a slow, delayed reflex, and then you're like, that is something. So once you're used to seeing a delayed reflex, I think that is a very interesting sort of in-office confirmatory test you can do. And basal body temperature, hi Patty, as well, I think is still something. Those are pieces, you know, I think
That's the test where you stick a thermometer under your armpit before you get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, 5 days, I do it for 10 minutes, 5 days in a row. I think it's effective. I think it also empowers the patient. I do education with the patient and involve them in their treatment plan. And of course, I know we're probably going to get to this, but in searching hard for the reason why a thyroid would start to underfunction, adrenal testing and adrenal assessment is so pivotally important.
Yeah, I think those two glands just go hand in hand.
Hand in hand.
What do you think about the iodine question?
The iodine question.
So should patients with autoimmune hypothyroid be taking iodine?
Here's been my experience clinically, and what I've noticed is that yes, iodine can certainly rev up an autoimmune reaction. But if you take care of the, you know, get your good ORAC value in there and you take care of the free radicals and put antioxidants on board. So of course selenium, N-acetylcysteine, I use high-dose curcumin in absorbable forms. What I've seen is if I can get the oxidative stress down and antioxidants on board, then and there's an iodine deficiency, because we are deficient in iodine again. We are, and it's a big building block of our thyroid hormone.
And do you think this is primarily because a lot of us are not eating iodized salt anymore? We're eating sea salt and Himalayan pink salt and things like that?
I think it is a
Or
contributing
just
factor.
restricting salt completely?
I think it's a contributing factor for sure. I mean, you see it in the research, the way, as you described when I had to leave, the way it has sort of played out throughout the years. But I think it's very important. So then I give a little bit of iodine and I watch the TPO, but usually once I do due diligence with the antioxidants, giving that iodine helps the patient feel better and their TPO stays down. But I'd like to get that TPO antibody down first with the concomitant antioxidants.
So do you, if the patient's taking a multivitamin that has 150 micrograms of iodine, is that, you think that's problematic?
115 micrograms. So I think the literature around the world, an appropriate daily dose would be 1 to 2 milligrams. Now, there are people that are on 3, 6, 12.5, 50, 25. I know a gentleman whom I love dearly who takes 50 milligrams of iodine every single day, and he seems to be doing lovely at 81 years old. I do think the case with iodine is it has to be a very specific, individualized case, and there's no cookie cutter way of going about it.
Okay. What do you think, there's some controversy that fluorine and chlorine and bromine compete with iodine and create a problem?
Sure, I think it's a big problem. Those are halides, so very similar on the periodic table as iodine, and we're iodine deficient, then that's exactly what's going to happen. We're going to suck those in from our environment, and I think that's probably spurring on a little bit of the thyroid cancers that we're seeing an increase in the last 6 years. And they're also destabilizing to the thyroid themselves, yes.
So what are some of the underlying causes of autoimmune thyroid? I mean, there's a whole list we can go into, maybe starting with gut.
I think that's the biggest thing. So, I mean, obviously we all probably know, and I had a wonderful conversation with a very esteemed endocrinologist, and I asked him if Hashimoto's thyroiditis, an autoimmune condition, is the #1 cause of underfunctioning thyroid. Why don't you all draw antibodies? And the answer was great, and it was very clear and I think appropriate to their scope. Their treatment would not be any different. You're still going to drive, in Western allopathic conventional medicine, reductionistic conventional medicine, which there is a place for, and there is a place for every system of medicine, I believe. They're still going to get that TSH within normal limits. But you know, if you don't stop that autoimmune reaction, wherever it is you find it, then the symptoms are going to continue, and so will that reaction. And I don't know how many times in my practice I have seen women go into, I'll say, a premature menopause, because I believe that autoimmune reaction had not been stopped at the thyroid and went on to attack yet another gland, and it was most likely their ovaries. And so the gut is the #1 place that I go to as soon as I see high antibodies. I mean, just certainly taking a good, clear history, understanding heavy metal exposure, environmental exposure, extremely, extremely important. But clearing up any infections, H. pylori, sometimes a silent H. pylori is really important, I think, to clear up in Hashimoto's thyroiditis. But getting in and doing your 4, 5, 6 R's of that gut restoration, the removing, the reinoculation, the restoring those nutrients.
Do you have a protocol for testing the gut if you suspect that's a problem, or there's certain
Yeah,
tests
there's
that you
so
like to
many
run?
great, and that's another thing I wanted to just allow people to know. Even though I've been a consultant in the natural product industry, that's not why I'm here. I have no conflicts of interest whatsoever. I've always said it's more about the approach I care about than the agent. We have a lot of resources and connections, and there's great laboratories out there and wonderful manufacturing companies that have synergistic, ingredients to treat thyroid, as Adam was saying, about thyrosol, et cetera. So, but with testing, there's some really great testing when it comes for dysbiosis. I think from a fungal perspective, from a bacterial perspective, from a permeability, hyperpermeability perspective. So
What tests in particular do you like to run?
So I will run, there's a new test from Vibrant America out called Weitz. So it has the zonulin in there so I can understand. There also is GI effects profile that was, I think, the combination of Genova and the other lab that they joined with.
Yeah.
I do that so you get a little bit of look at their microbiome. So cleaning up those infections are extremely important.
So you do a stool test?
Stool test for sure.
Right, do you do breath tests?
Yep, yes. Now, more and more, I have been sort of poking around and just making sure that I rule out SIBO because it's a bugger, certainly, when people have it, and it's a whole different treatment protocol and treatment regime than just your average dysbiosis, and so breath tests for that, absolutely.
And you mentioned H. pylori, and there's been a number of papers linking H. pylori with Hashimoto's autoimmune. What do you think is the best way to test for H. pylori?
You know, you can do blood and you can do stool, you know,
Right, yes.
and I often do both.
Okay.
Ben, I want to make a comment on that one.
Yeah?
You know, I'm not sure if they
Here.
check those patients for H. pylori for SIBO. I mean, we do, you know, probably about 1,000 SIBO, you know, tests a year, and we frequently see free T3 being associated with it. And partly, you know, I think that's because the T3 becomes active in the gut. About 20 to 30% of that becomes active. The T4 goes to the liver metabolism, and then another part of it becomes active. So if you have gut dysbiosis, so I'm not convinced that the H. pylori that they keep associating with different illnesses is really the cause, or was there another SIBO sitting next to it? Because a lot of our patients have both of them. So on this one, somebody has shown that I'm not convinced that the H. pylori, you may be treating H. pylori, but you may also be treating the SIBO.
Especially if you're using herbs that have a broad spectrum.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to know. Maybe there is some association. I mean, there are so many rare diseases. You know, I had another patient with Henoch-Schönlein purpura coming in, but when we checked, the patient also had bad SIBO, you know, and the zonulin may go up, you know, perhaps because of the damage to the small intestine. And there's more research coming out that the Paneth cells, which is something we probably don't think about it too much, have a lot of antimicrobial effects that comes out from them. And they're sitting right next to the stem cell in the crypts of the small intestine. And that's an area that has a lot of interest for us because the next question would be how do you stimulate Paneth cells and the stem cells to produce the Paneth cells? If you don't actually have that, you can't get rid of the SIBO. Okay.
What are the Paneth cells?
They look like eosinophil type cells. They're sitting at the bottom of the crypt, but they produce compounds called defensins that they work as an antimicrobial effect. They have this hydrogen peroxide type effect. So this area is very, very interesting, and I did some research on it, and there are some natural products that they may actually increase this stem cell turnover. For example, we're using now oxytocin, we're using estriol, you know, like a low dose of estriol for that. And then I came across black cohosh cream, you know, that tripentins and these type of natural products that they may actually stimulate that. So you're not going to see a whole lot of research, but it's a little bit safe to try it, maybe it's worth doing it. But I really think that we're underestimating the value of the SIBO. I mean, there's probably a lot of it. There are at least, in our practice, at least 50% of people are referred. They usually have a bad one, you know. We get all the ones that are difficult to treat.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you for your input, Dr. Rafa.
And you're here when? Next
The
time?
22nd
The
of
22nd.
February.
All right.
Have to get that night off too.
Can you talk about the relationship between gluten and thyroid?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially with the Hashimoto situation, I think the number, if somebody was going to a deserted island and said, I can only do one thing that you tell me, and I would say then get off gluten 100%, you know, for at least 60 days. There was an article, it was a pediatrics article, I think it was diabetes and Hashimoto's, gluten-sensitive Hashimoto's, that was reversed in a 12-year-old, I believe, with gluten-free. Before that was just 30 days, and so that is really, really, really important. And that is where patient education and doctors, teacher, I mean, you know, I've always said too, it's not about the agent, it's about the approach. And with there being value in all systems of medicine, here, take this as easy medicine. Here, take your Synthroid is easy medicine to my patients. It is. You go, you get that filled, you pay your copay, screw that cap in the morning, you take your medicine, and then that's it. What I ask of my patients when we are discovering and uncovering the multiple layers of their hypometabolism, I should say, is a lot. And so I always think that there's a difference between compliance and adherence, right? So compliance is, oh, she told me to do that. And adherence is really a faithful attachment to something. And so I work hard to do that education and put those dots really close together so that and go slow, one thing at a time, and give the research, let them know, gluten-free is such a connotated issue, right? Everybody's gluten-free, gluten-free, gluten-free. To get down into the research and to allow people to understand why that is so important has probably been one of the best things that I can do when I'm working with somebody like this.
Can you talk about the role of chronic infections as it relates to autoimmune thyroid problems? David Brady, he has a paper talking about autoimmunity, and he talks about Yersinia and how it's through the mechanism of molecular mimicry, how the body it attacks the thyroid gland because it's similar in protein structure.
Right, so, I mean, whenever I come across that, and it's certainly one of those things that I do is clear up those infections, anything to get those T lymphocytes, that immune system to settle down. That is, in fact, the thyroid at the point in time is just almost out the door for me when it comes to those antibodies being up. That is my focus for a bit. Focusing on the thyroid, especially the numbers, never gets me anywhere, and it never gets my patients anywhere regarding their symptoms. I fight hard to understand, and I explain to them too about those antibodies being elevated. And one of the things that I use, it was back in the 80s, when friends, first HIV was on the scene, and they would go get their numbers tested. And I was saying, well, their numbers is their T cells versus the viral load, right? And you always want your immune system to be sort of more activated than the virus itself. And so when I explain that these antibodies are firing and there's a reaction that's going on, it's so important that we watch that TPO and we actually strike real hard to get that down. So the question is what numbers? Like, I'd like to see TPO within normal range, under 9 would be great. And I've had some cases where they're slightly above that, and I don't do very much, especially if that is not matching a clinical picture. They might be going through stress, they might be going through infection, they might be going through something else. I don't automatically diagnose them with Hashimoto's disease. I definitely keep an eye on it, testing about 2 to 3 months later and see what it does. A lot of times that goes right back under 9. Yeah. So the question is, how do I treat SIBO? In my clinical experience, well, first of all, I've done both, using antibiotics and also herbal medicines. In my experience, the antibiotics are more effective, or not more effective, sorry. They work quicker. And then I think what's so important is to make sure that you follow that patient and understand that relapse is definitely something that happens, and get them out of the entire, make sure that you're following them and monitoring them closely and educating about SIBO and about the trajectory of healing. So I have used herbals for people that don't want antibiotics, because that is definitely a choice, but also I've used antibiotics.
Can you talk about the role of inflammation in autoimmune thyroid? Some of the literature indicates that inflammation decreases thyroid receptor sensitivity.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, and once again, we're looking at, well, where's that inflammation coming from? When you think about elevated cortisol is it's an inflammatory hormone. Elevated cortisol will decrease thyroid receptor site. Also, the number one thing that will do that is a low vitamin D level. And a low vitamin D level, not just one click above rickets, where a couple of people will come in like, my vitamin D is fine, it's 30. The range is like 30 to 100. And so inflammation, absolutely. I think, and once again, when you're looking at inflammation, there's, I think, a couple of ways it affects thyroid function, but at the receptor site is where I see it. So getting those good antioxidants on board, anti-inflammatories. I love the curcumin just because it has so many different and poignant mechanisms of action, and it's so great for thyroid patients with infection, with anti-inflammatory, with antioxidant. It's just sort of my favorite botanical when we're looking at thyroid.
I just wanted to mention, since
What
we
does the curcumin, I'm sorry.
What dose of curcumin? I usually try to study the research, or follow the research. So of course with curcumin, we're looking at the dose of curcuminoids that we get into the bloodstream. And there are different licensed ingredients out there that are bound to absorption agents. But I like to go to about 500 milligrams of curcuminoids twice a day. So it's a little whopping dose. Some people get a little loose stool with that, some people not at all, but if so, I just pull it back a little bit.
I just wanted to mention, we've been talking about testing for thyroid, and our friends SpectraCell offer some very, very reasonably priced testing for thyroid. You can get a complete thyroid panel if the patients have almost any insurance for only $45. And most of the time, if they go to the lab, SpectraCell will pick up the blood draw as well.
Yeah, those are interesting business models. My patients love them. I mean, that's awesome. That's great. And you said Kaiser, HMOs, covered California? That's awesome. And Medicare. Not Medi-Cal, so.
We take many, I have a related question. Have you looked at Graves' disease, which is also on, or you just focused on Hashimoto's?
Well, tonight, it was just supposed to be under-functioning of the thyroid. But there's another, is it TSI that you can run as far as an antibody for Graves' disease. I don't see a lot of Graves' disease, and I have to be honest, I haven't had a lot of experience with it. But, you know, honestly, I have to say that if you catch Hashimoto's early enough, it would be categorized as Graves' disease, because you've got what? Probably 4 months of T4 stored in your thyroid, and you start attacking that gland, and that T4 is released and then converted. I've seen this going back in historical lab results with patients, where their TSH is actually suppressed and their levels are elevated because of that stored T4, but if the reaction continues, that's when everything starts to just go the other way.
So let's talk about toxins and how that's related to autoimmune thyroid, and there's a whole series of toxins that could be related. Do you have a favorite way of screening or testing, as well as, you know, looking at history, of course?
Yeah, that's the biggest thing. I pulled these slides from my presentation. There are a lot. Joe Pizzorno dropped a book this past February called The Toxin Solution, and literally, I love him so much. He took his advance and hired researchers, and with his advance, and just researched the heck out of everything. And The Toxin Solution is a great book, but the bottom line, the take home from the book is that toxins in our environment are really the driver of our chronic health issues. And the goal that we need to sort of put in ourselves and in with our patients is to live more and more sustainably. That's the only way we're going to get out of this. And so I think about that all the time. But boy, there are dietary factors, there are chemicals, and certainly I start with that good clinical acumen and that good history, because you don't want to just do all of this testing. I mean, you can, and of course we have the ability to, so that's great. The more data, the best. But I do start with, I'll never forget this one woman I was working with, and I don't know how I missed it or how, it just was one of those things where I wasn't poking around the right area. But it was on one of our follow-ups, and she wasn't moving. I mean, as far as I thought she should be with everything that we put on board, and the good naturopathic care and everything that she had accomplished. But she mentioned, she said, well, my family owns a string of dry cleaners, you know, and I grew up in, and I was like, wait, what? What did you say? You know, and so I was off and running with that. Toxic mold, I had a patient when I was able to take a good history, and so I, you know, sort of bird dogged that one, and when we clean that up. So that's sort of the fun part about, you know, being able to look at this and not just treat the engine light, but look at where the engine is faltering. But I think that environmental toxins, you have to take a look at it. And there are many panels out in the functional medicine labs that you can discover if there's been exposure and accumulation. And also,
Are there any panels that you think are more valid? You know, we have urine testing for metals, we have urine challenge testing, we have serum testing, you know, there's hair testing, you know. What, are there any particular go-to panels that you like to run?
I do use Genova's the urine test, the challenge test quite a bit, and like that.
And how do you challenge them?
They have the
Use the DMSA?
yeah, the DMSA, yeah,
Okay,
yeah. That's the one that I've used in the past,
right.
yeah. But you know, any way that you can get the data. I don't really have a favorite one per se. But
Okay.
any way you can get the data, especially if, I mean, it goes to the question like, why do we run lab tests in the first place? It's to confirm clinical suspicions, you know? So I think that's really important.
Good. Estrogen fluctuations, high estrogen will often lead to an increase in thyroid binding proteins. Can you talk about how hormones like estrogen and testosterone can affect thyroid?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think the number one thing when we're looking at, let's say, functional hypothyroidism, okay, so that is, you've got okay production at the glands, so that T4 is fine, but what is happening? You know, you still have signs of hypometabolism. And two reasons there, I would say it was a decrease in conversion or an increase in binding. Three big things as far as increase in binding would be too much thyroid therapy, right? Supraphysiological doses of thyroid hormone, 1 or 2 or 3, all of these things can happen. You have a decrease in endogenous production, you've got an increase in binding globulin because the brain is kind of smart and it's like, that's a little bit more than I've ever had in my entire life. I think I'm gonna save you from yourself, and it will bind that up. And then also, it'll have either a decrease in receptor sites or a decrease in the response to the receptor sites. And so the other thing is estrogen dominance or estrogen therapies for sure. Increases thyroid binding globulin, also increases sex hormone binding globulin, which will increase or will bind up free testosterone. And I think the joke is, as far as oral contraceptives, you know, you increase thyroid binding globulin, so your metabolism is down. You increase your sex hormone binding globulin, so your free testosterone, you're like, you have no energy, you have no drive. It's great birth control for the most part. But estrogen dominance is definitely one of those things. And the last one is sleep disturbances. You know, so a lot of times I'll be able to look at a patient who I feel is having functional hypothyroidism as far as not being able to get that T4 to T3 and then into the receptor site, and I just go, check, 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 you know?
What do you think about the role of immune system balance? Dr. Karazian talks a lot about the TH1 to TH2 balance.
Yeah, his book was fascinating. I mean, I think when it comes to that, and balancing the TH1 and the TH2, those T helper cells,
Yeah.
and there's different components, natural components, I can't cite them all, but they're out there, and ways to figure out which is dominant. I think it's pretty intense though. I haven't successfully mastered that, but I think I take it into consideration when you're dealing with the immune system. But my whole goal is always just to get those lymphocytes sort of settled down and understanding what is provoking the immune system.
Yeah, I concur. Even though he's clearly one of the smartest guys out there, I found his approach to thyroid way too complex.
I agree. And then some, right?
Let's talk about the role of nutritional deficiencies as related to thyroid problems. So maybe we could talk about vitamin D as one.
Sure. So vitamin D, I think that's really important because the number one cause of what I would say hypometabolism or functional hypometabolism. So the gland is fine, you've got T4, you've got conversion is great, T3, but T3 is not getting into the nucleus of each and every cell in your body. The number one reason for that is a low vitamin D level. And so I think also we think of things like ferritin. I always run a ferritin, and once again, we like to see optimal levels, right? So vitamin D, I'm thinking around 60 to 80. Ferritin, I like to see around 90 to 110. I know ranges are different sometimes, so I tend to cut off 25% off the beginning of the range and 25% off, and just try to get more optimal for folks. You know, a lot of people are doing genetic testing these days, and there's a VDR mutation for vitamin D. that has popped up quite a bit in the epigenetic world, and if somebody has that, they have a really hard time absorbing vitamin D, so 5,000, 10,000 IUs a day is what they need to be on. That's really important to understand. And then I don't know of another, nutrients, I always tell people that if you ever take a biochemistry class, it's like taking a nutrition class, right? Because every single biochemical function we have in our body is fueled by a cofactor that's a vitamin or a mineral. These are not just a couple aisles in our Whole Foods. This is our body working in. But the thyroid is pretty nutrient dependent. You've got that 5' deiodinase that's very selenium dependent, zinc, chromium, copper. You could go on and on and on and on, magnesium. And so nutritional deficiencies, I think, are really important. Selenium, our manufactured, our agriculture, our soils, I think we're low in selenium, and sometimes I will draw a serum selenium level too, if I'm suspecting that. Selenium is one of those things that I definitely use to get that TPO down.
How accurate is the serum selenium level in terms of, being related to tissue levels?
I don't know the answer to that question. Do? Okay.
I just know in general that nutrient status, it's
Right.
in the bloodstream
Right.
is not necessarily indicative of tissue levels.
Exactly, and I think we could say that for all, for most laboratory, assessments, that you always want to, even with hormones, whether you're doing your metabolites or the saliva or blood, it's like, what is going on at the tissue level? And I think that's when, you use that clinical acumen and you use labs as part of the puzzle pieces and sort of help you understand the full clinical picture.
And iron is a big one as well.
Iron, yeah, absolutely. Iron is huge, and getting that ferritin up. Ferritin is important for that receptor site responsiveness as well. Also, cortisol is needed too, and so high cortisol, it's tricky. High cortisol is going to stop the receptor site responsiveness, but cortisol is needed to get the transcription of T3 into the nucleus. So low cortisol, if you're going to have optimal thyroid function, you have to have optimal adrenal function, period. And a lot of times that's where it's like the thyroid becomes secondary, and where do you go for the root cause problem? And a lot of times I'll be hanging out with those the lifestyle things and stress modulation and healing the adrenals. And I think also, just while we're on this, if you don't mind, it's really important because sometimes there's, if you have if you have a patient in a catabolic state, so more gearing towards wearing and tearing versus being able to grow and heal, okay? And you rev up their metabolism by increasing their thyroid because they want more energy, what are you gonna do? You're going to increase the catabolic state. You're gonna increase their ability to wear and tear. They don't feel good at all. So a lot of times I see people chase the thyroid dosage, right? Like, oh, you need more energy, let's increase your thyroid, and it's just not the right way to go about it. And then also I've seen too where sometimes we need to get a little bit of cortisol on the opposite end to actually get the thyroid to be more responsive. And so devil's in the details with this one. Hope it'll confuse you more than I help you, that's for sure.
How do you like to test adrenals? Are you using the salivary adrenal test?
I do like the 4-point DHE cortisol salivary test, I do. In the office, I'll do an iris contraction test, which is just one of those things, if they've got a partner with them or what have you, it's fun just to see that pupillary response, but I do like the 4-point cortisol and DHEA, that nice diurnal rhythm.
When it comes to thyroid medication, there's a lot of choices. There's synthetic T4, you got synthetic T3, we have natural thyroid, Armor, Nature Thyroid, etc., and we have compounded thyroid. What's your preference? How often, what do you like to use a lot?
Well, I really am particular with dosing sometimes in individuals, and so I do tend to compound because then I can be a little bit more specific with dosing, depending on what I feel is going on in the clinical picture. And I have to say, my good friend who's a pharmacist says, natural thyroid is natural for pigs, it's not natural. Porcine derivative thyroid. But I also have a lot of patients that come to me on agents, and let's say somebody who comes with Hashimoto's and they've been on Synthroid for years. There's times where if they're doing okay and I just want to treat the autoimmune condition, I won't just take them off and put them on something that I prefer. I kind of leave it alone, especially if I know they're converting okay. But I'll have people that are on Synthroid, synthetic T4, and you go down the reasons why people don't convert: alcoholism, or alcohol use, sleep disturbances, chronic stress, SSRIs, beta blockers, and I can just go, okay, I know that there's an issue there. And so that's when you want maybe to have a little bit more T3 on board, or if the reverse T3 is high.
So when you make up a compounded formula, do you typically do T4 with low T3, or just do T4, or how often do you use
All
that?
depends on the individual and what's going
Okay.
on with binding, with, a large percentage of our T4 and T3 are bound, right? Very, very few is free. So binding changes have a big effect. So sometimes I'm just working on getting those binding globulins down, working on that lifestyle, working on diet, not so much tinkering around with the dose, but yeah, it all depends, and that's why I think
How do you-
compounding.
How do you like to get binding globulins down?
So, well, first of all, if they're on super physiological dose of thyroid, slowly but surely, you want to kind of pull that down. Also, making sure that they're sleeping well, and so that's another whole can of worms, and I'm sure another entire Santa Monica Functional Medicine Group discussion on insomnia and sleep issues, but that's extremely important. Also, if there have estrogen dominance, maybe that I should look at an MTHFR issue because the detoxification pathways could be affected, and so that's another thing to think about, because you always are looking at the liver when you're thinking about thyroid, not that just your liver is heavily involved in the conversion of T4 to T3, but also detoxification pathways for the toxins and things, and so looking at getting estrogen out through the cytochrome P450 pathways, diindolylmethane, using things like that if they're estrogen dominant. So whatever is causing the binding, then that's where I go for.
Do you ever use timed release
Time release,
thyroid?
yeah, I like time release T3 at times. I'm sort of, what I would love to do with folks is do as natural as possible. So we get most of that T4 pro hormone, and then depend on the body. So I like to mimic that as much as I can, sort of just restore the natural ability for the thyroid to function by, as I said in the beginning, understanding where the problems are and working on those problems, instead of, because I think you do run a risk of increasing binding globulins across the board, and especially if you're just giving straight T3 and not really worrying about anything else, just going for the metabolism, just going for the energy, and I see that happening, and I see patients wanting it from me.
Well, naturally in the body, there's a certain ratio between T4 and T3. And one of your arguments for the porcine glandular thyroids is that has a very similar ratio, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's like 4.2 to 1.
right.
Yeah, so in a 60 milligram, you've got 9 micrograms of T3
Right.
to, isn't that interesting though? I think I have this written down because about that, if you think about it, regarding thyroid hormone and natural thyroid, like the porcine, I've often thought of this, hold on here. You can think about the next question.
Yeah, another thing, another argument that's sometimes made is that patients who've been on Synthroid for a long time have an increased risk of bone loss. And one of the arguments for using a porcine thyroid supplement is that there's a small amount of calcitonin. Yes.
Right, well, that's what I was gonna say. I can't find it. These notes are worthless to me. Because I didn't a mind right now, but, so if you think about 60 milligrams, right, that's 6,000 micrograms, right? In a 1 grain of Armour or porcine thyroid. And you're looking at the T4 to T3, which is about, 98 micrograms, 9 micrograms, it's something like that. What else is in there? You're right, so I think there's a little T1, T2, there's probably a little calcitonin, selenium. There's a lot more filler, there could be some fillers in there. Sometimes if people are really hyperreactive, I do like using the YP thyroid, which is, I think, the cleanest that I've seen out there from the porcine derivatives. Yeah.
I was listening to Michael Ruscio's podcast. He was talking about a patient who wasn't responding to any form of thyroid. He put him on the liquid thyroid, the Tyrosint or something like
The
that.
Tyrosint, yeah, and that's cleaner, I believe, than the Synthroid.
Right, because there's binders in all these products, and
Yep.
that's one of the issues. people react to one binder versus another. So I wanted to bring up the question of subclinical hypothyroidism. And I think there's actually two different sort of situations that both get combined together. And so you mentioned a little bit earlier, subclinical hypothyroidism and what we might call sublaboratory hypothyroidism. So basically sublaboratory hypothyroidism is patients who have symptoms of thyroid disease. Maybe they're a little bit vague, or they just have fatigue, or they have chronic fatigue, or they have brain fog, or a few of these symptoms, but their tests are normal. And then you have patients, and then clinicians who said, look, despite what the tests show, I think you need thyroid, put them on thyroid, they do better. So that's the sublaboratory hypothyroidism. And then we have the subclinical hypothyroidism, which is patients who test for, say, an elevated TSH, but don't have any symptoms. And then the question is, do we want to treat them just because they have an elevated TSH? The argument for why you want to treat them is because statistically they have an increased risk of going on to having, true hypothyroidism. On the other hand, there's studies showing that if you do nothing, half of them will be fine in 32 months. And then there's also potentially a risk of increased cardiovascular disease in patients who have an elevated TSH.
Yes.
So.
What's the question?
So what about the sublaboratory hypothyroidism? Patients who have fatigue and you put them on some thyroid and you feel better, even though the testing doesn't really indicate that, or maybe you do some, complicated way of testing. You look at the T3 to T3, reverse T3 ratio, or you just look at ankle reflex.
I think this is also depend on the age. I mean, if you get someone 70 and 80, you're going to put them on, thyroid medications. They have subclinical hypothyroid. I've seen several cases. I order TSH in everybody.
Sure.
And free T3 and free T4. So it's very common to see elevated TSH.
In elderly, well, yeah, and it increases actually as we age. TSH, absolutely. So let me try this. Let me just try to respond to that, if you don't mind. Okay. So what's interesting to me about subclinical hypothyroidism, well, and I think it's just a matter of what we try to do from our scope of practice, which is diagnose a disease. I think when you mentioned disease, and I think maybe the key word is the disease part, because if you, when I think about subclinical, and I've been a stickler, and I think you mentioned the article that I wrote in the Townsend letter about nobody has adrenal fatigue, but they might have something else, and I didn't mean to say that, but I was just trying to get everybody around me certainly to be more, I would say, consistent with the literature, because there's a lot of these watchdog groups out there that are looking at those of us who say adrenal fatigue and not being consistent with the literature where it's, adrenal dysregulation or, hypoadrenalism or what have you, more consistent with the literature, and even hyperpermeability when we're talking about leaky gut, more of these slang words that people are getting hooked up on. And it's great because you can, our consumers, and our patients know about it. But I think, so we're looking at these things as far as clinical hypothyroidism, so laboratory hypothyroidism. And I've always said, I think clinical hypothyroidism is used wrongly because or subclinical hypothyroidism, I think, what is subclinical about my patient's clinical symptoms, for sure. As far as sublaboratory hypothyroidism in the diagnosis, I also think that is used wrongly as well, because that's one of the biggest controversies out there. Which labs to draw, what ranges to use, what do they actually mean? So when I think about it all, I actually look at a word that I like to use a lot, which is dysregulation. It's the thyroid is dysregulated, and it's the sort of investigation of figuring out why and fixing those problems, if that engine light thing again.
And I think some of the papers indicate that if you have somebody who has an elevated TSH and it's below 10, that's kind of the cutoff. If it's above 10, you ought to consider, even if they're older and don't have a lot of symptoms, that may be increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease, for example.
Yeah, and I think each patient is different, but also in doing no harm, the best, I think the best sort of feedback and data that you can get if you trial somebody on a small dose of thyroid is your patient's symptoms or their response, and you can always use that, you know, as a monitor as well. Do they feel better? I think that's really important.
How do you handle hair loss when you start thyroid supplementation? Is that something, you know, we think about maybe a low thyroid can cause hair loss, but occasionally you give thyroid hormone of any sort and then you get hair loss. How do you?
You know, that is it. I have
So
seen.
the question is, how do you
Oh, sorry.
deal with hair loss related to giving thyroid?
So then you mobilize the thyroid a little bit?
You see an increase in hair loss by when you start to give thyroid?
Are you seeing that, and do you understand the mechanism of action behind
Well,
that?
to me, anything that goes wrong in the body can cause hair loss. That's why you read the whole chapter on hair loss. What did I learn? But most likely is a manifestation of inflammation. That means that to be able to control that, you know, I think the inflammatory process has to calm down.
I would 100%
So the
agree with
hair
you.
follicles would not respond to any variation in physiological, you know, ambiance, if you will.
I mean, I think hair thinning and hair loss in women especially is probably one of the most devastating symptoms that brings people into my practice, and it's also one of the most desperate symptoms that they have, and I agree with you, it's the same thing, you know. Of course, they come in on biotin and really good choices based on their Google search and such, but I do think that the mechanism is so much deeper, and that's really where the work is. And you gotta fight for it, but I agree with you.
All of it have to go to
Sure.
for the winter.
Well, when I come, I'm gonna leave early for yours too. Just kidding. I'm totally just joking. It is very nice to have you here.
I will catch up with another appointment.
The 22nd, make sure you come.
Yeah.
Earlier you had said about testing reverse T3 that you look at the clinical symptoms. So what exact clinical symptoms would tell you that you need to test the reverse T3 or not?
All right, so if you go back, T4 is metabolized to reverse T3 and T3 pretty proportionally, right? And what would suspect me to run a reverse T3 is a high catecholamine lifestyle. High catecholamine lifestyle sometimes leading to a deficiency state, but it really is that stress, and then there are clinical symptoms of hypometabolism, but it could be hypoadrenalism as well. Because what I see happen is that high catecholamine, you know, high cortisol is going to stop that conversion from T4 to T3, and anything that stops the 5' deiodinase working, not only do you not clear it, you clear it to reverse T3, which is 5' deiodinase. 5' deiodinase from reverse T3 goes to, I could write this down, but goes to T1, which is actually a little bit active, or T2 I should say. So high cortisol is the #1 thing that does that. So what's happening in the body, like I said, you know, I kind of made a joke of 16-hour days, coffee and Krispy Kreme. The body is like, you know what? You can't keep up this pace. And so the receptor site gets filled with that inactive thyroid hormone of reverse T3 as a compensatory mechanism. So a lot of times when I see us trying to diagnose something, it's really just our bodies responding appropriately to, you know, it's a compensatory mechanism. It's actually an appropriate response to what we're putting it through. And so that's where, and then if that reverse T3 is high, that's where the education comes in, and that's where we've got to start, you know, and the last thing you want to do then in that state is increase T4, right? Because all you do is you feed the reverse T3. You feed the reverse T3, you've got more receptor sites being filled up with actually an inert substance, which doesn't give anything to the cells, no metabolism, no gas, you know, in the tank, no pedal. You're just, so that's usually what it is. It's that, and I have a woman right now that I'm working with, and I ran her reverse T3, and I think it was 39 at the time. But she's got a lot of eustress. She has a big life and a big job and a big personality, but her hair is falling out. She's gaining weight that she has never had this problem before. You know, it's just like check, 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 check.
say
What
that
about the
I-
adrenals?
I was just gonna say that I tend to test the reverse T3 on everyone. I like just doing the whole thyroid
Yeah.
panel because I just think that sometimes you don't realize how stressed people are. Some people hide it a lot.
And it's actually kind of like the norm, right? Yeah, it's sort of like our new normal, and so I agree with you. I think that's great.
But back to the adrenals. So you were saying that high cortisol obviously really hindered the conversion process of T3, of T4 to T3. So it's funny, I've been doing adrenal testing for really almost 10 years now. And I would say 90% of the people that I test, they have adrenal fatigue. It's not high cortisol levels. And I asked when I did my A4M fellowship a few years ago, everybody's got adrenal fatigue. She said, that's 9/11, that's the norm now. So I don't really, by the time I see someone and I'm suspecting adrenal dysfunction, they already have stage 2 or 3, oftentimes 3. So how does that and the thyroid get together? Because a lot of symptoms are very similar.
Yeah, well, a lot of symptoms of hypometabolism overlap with candida infections. They'll overlap with iron deficiency. I mean, they definitely similar, and I think that's another quagmire. But by Petra, 100%. If you're going to have a normal functioning thyroid, I think the adrenals you have to work hard at, and sometimes concomitantly. But the adrenals, you can't have a normal optimal functioning thyroid without optimal adrenals. Not low, not high, optimal. And it's worth it to restore, and boy, the taking talk home point for patients with that is that it takes time. The way that I like to liken it for patients sometimes, and I've used this analogy, and you might think it's cheesy as all get out, but it does work. I take their life and I'm like, let's say as a bank account, your health is like a bank account and you are in debt, okay? Your health is in debt. Now, I'll ask them, have you ever been in debt financially, blah, 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 whatever, right? And most people go, yeah. I'm like, how do you get out of debt? You make more deposits than you do withdrawals. And I kind of, because when they say like, how long is it gonna take me to get out of this? I'm like, well, our job is to identify and increase the deposit that we can make, and also then identify and mitigate the withdrawals. And sometimes it's on a daily basis that I have them sort of keep track, because the quicker they can save and mitigate the withdrawals. There's always going to be automatic withdrawals. We've all got a lot going on. People have a lot going on. But what can we do? Where are the nutritional deficiencies that we are cleaning up? Where are the lifestyle interventions? Where's the dietary stuff? Where's even the hydration, simple things where we can make more deposits. Then I tell them, we're going to get out of this. We're going to get, and not just paycheck to paycheck, we're going to get you into a health savings account so you can afford a piece of cheesecake, or what have you. So that's how but it takes a long time.
Yeah, it does.
Time.
That's a long time. How about hypocaloric diets and prolonged fasting and reversing?
So I think your question is, how about hypocaloric diets and prolonged fasting and reverse T3? Well, the literature says, and I think in clinical experience, that it would increase reverse T3 because the body would say that, this is a fasting state and we're going to slow down metabolism, because the more that you would have metabolism on board, the more you would burn, and if the body has a signal that you're not getting calorie or energy in, then that's going to be a compensatory mechanism. So.
Do you actually see that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Now, this kind of just brings me up to a point with some of the intermittent fasting and things that I think are really valuable. It's another adrenal thing. There are some people, your brain requires blood sugar to function, right?
Or ketones.
Or what?
Or ketones.
Or ketones. Oh, okay, well, let's just, for my story, we're just gonna say blood sugar. But you're probably right, but people, and I wouldn't say they're on purpose fasting. This is like out the door, grabbing a coffee, and they're off to work, and I haven't eaten, and it's 1 o'clock. But when we're trying to heal, the adrenal, you look at it because it's a stress response. Your adrenals have to tell your brain to tell your liver to kick out glycogen. And so you're not really thriving ever, you're always in survival. Your body is gonna do what it needs to do to keep you alive. But I think that it's an extra stressor, and so sometimes when people ask me about intermittent fasting, I get them ready for it and get them healthy enough for it. It's kind of like somebody going through a detox. not everybody you would detox, right, because their phase 2 is probably down-regulated and they're gonna feel really bad. You kind of almost have to get them ready for that, so I see that quite a bit too.
I think it's a good point because this is like the fad now, intermittent fasting.
It
I
is.
just and now the new thing is FMD, fasting mimicking diet. But not too long ago, you just published this book, The Longevity
Prolon
Diet.
and the fasting.
But I think you got a
diets.
really good point. I mean, if they've got the thyroid, the adrenal, all this stuff is off, and you just put them on that kind of a eating diet program, it may not be the best thing.
I agree, and I've seen it too, and especially with people that are trying to. I mean, certainly we're looking at changing metabolic syndrome and some of those things that are creeping up and that are life-threatening or putting them at risk for mortality and morbidity. But when people are using it for weight loss, unfortunately, if those other things don't have little checks by their boxes, they just gain it right back, and then some. And that's just the pain part of it is. So lots of education, doctors, teacher, dossier, to teach.
Okay, if we don't have any further questions, then thank you for coming.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, Dr. Lucille.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. You do a great job. Thanks so much.